The day they read my husband's will, the whole parlor laughed. Not quiet laughter, not polite hand-over-mouth laughter, but the full, ugly, head-thrown-back kind that comes from people who have been waiting for something to mock and have finally found it. 3 church women, 2 orphan girls who'd come to watch the spectacle, and the lawyer from Hollow Creek who kept clearing his throat like he was embarrassed to be part of this at all. Mrs. Prudence Hargrove, matron of Mercy House, sat at the head of the table with her steel-gray bun pulled so tight it lifted her eyebrows into a permanent expression of judgment. She held the document like it smelled bad. When she finished reading the inventory aloud, 1 cabin, 1 smokehouse, 32 acres of mountain land, and what the document called existing provisions stored on the property, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Well, Mara Crow, it seems the dead have found one final way to make sport of the living. A smokehouse he would not use, a field he dug like a graveyard, and now all of it is yours." I was 17 years old. I had been a widow for 3 weeks. My mother died of childbed fever when I was 5. My father was crushed under a falling log wagon when I was 9, and I watched them carry his body down the mountain on a board. After that, I became something to be passed around. 8 months with Aunt Fanny Crow, who kept me for laundry until the food ran short. 5 months with the Holt family, who needed a nursemaid and didn't need opinions from the girl providing it. 11 months at Mercy House, where reading after lights out earned punishments and questions earned worse. At 16, I married Elias Vale because he was kind, because he needed help, and because he offered me something no one else ever had, a place where I might actually belong. And now Elias was dead, and what he'd left me was the laughingstock of 2 counties. Everyone in Hollow Creek knew about Elias Vale's graveyard pasture. That's what they called it. He'd built a beautiful smokehouse. The lawyer's document noted this with apparent confusion. Fresh pine boards, iron hinges, a proper roof. And then he'd never hung a single ham inside it. Instead, he'd spent his final summer digging deep pits across the open pasture, 6 of them, and burying sealed oak barrels in the ground. 600 pounds of salted meat, people said, buried in the dirt like corpses. The town decided he'd gone simple in the head. Even I had wondered, watching him come home covered in mud day after day, refusing to explain. The land itself was worthless. 32 acres of rocky ridge so steep and stony that the previous owner had sold it to Elias for $83 and a mule saddle. The cabin leaked, the fence sagged, and the pasture, what should have been open grazing land, was scarred with those 6 sunken circles where Elias had buried God knows what for God knows why. The provisions, the lawyer said carefully, appear to consist of barrels interred beneath the pasture. Their current condition is unknown. Someone in the back laughed again. "Rotted by now," a voice said. "Buried meat goes bad in a week." Mrs. Hargrove folded the document and slid it across the table toward me. "You are, of course, welcome to return to Mercy House until a suitable domestic position can be found. I'm sure someone in Elizabethton needs a scullery girl." I looked at the document. I looked at the inventory. 1 cabin, 1 smokehouse, 32 acres of land everyone said was worthless, and buried provisions everyone said were spoiled. I had $1.17 sewn into my hem. I had no family. I had nowhere else to go. And something lit up inside me. Not a match, but a furnace. Elias had spent his final summer digging those pits. He had worked until his body gave out. He had chosen that work over hay cutting, over fence mending, over everything else the town said a sensible farmer should do. And he had married me, not a pretty girl, not a connected girl, but a girl who read seed catalogs and agricultural bulletins and remembered what she read. There had to be a reason. He had seen something no one else could see, and he had left it to me. I picked up the document. "I'll be leaving for Laurel Gap tomorrow," I said. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Hargrove." The laughter stopped. Mrs. Hargrove's expression shifted into something between pity and contempt. "You'll be back within the month," she said. "The mountains don't forgive foolishness. If you want to find out what I discovered on that farm everyone called a graveyard, How a 17-year-old widow with nothing but a carpetbag and a dead man's journals turned a mocked pasture into something that saved an entire valley? Then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what my husband buried beneath that rocky ground, what I unearthed when the worst came and everyone else had nothing, is a story that still echoes in those mountains today. I left Mercy House 3 days later. Mrs. Hargrove didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved to be rid of the girl who read too much and now owned a dead man's foolishness. The wagon driver who took me up the mountain was a man named Holt, no relation to the family that had once kept me for nursemaid work. He spoke maybe 10 words the whole journey, and most of those were to the horse. That was fine with me. I had nothing to say to anyone. My husband was 3 weeks in the ground. I had $1.17 sewn into my hem, and I was going to claim a farm that everyone in 2 counties called Elias Vale's Graveyard Pasture. The road from Hollow Creek started out decent enough. Packed dirt, ruts from regular wagon traffic, the kind of surface that lets you believe civilization extends beyond the last building you passed. That lasted maybe 4 miles. Then the road narrowed, then it turned to clay. Then the laurel started reaching in from both sides like it wanted to reclaim whatever ground the road had stolen from it. By the last 2 miles, Holt was cursing under his breath, and the horse was fighting the mud with every step. The clay sucked at the wheels so hard I could hear it, a wet, pulling sound like the mountain was trying to swallow us. Rain had started falling somewhere in the last hour. Not heavy, just steady and cold, the kind that soaks through wool before you notice you're wet. I didn't know yet that this road would become my lifeline, that I'd walk it in snow and walk it in drought, and eventually walk it carrying things worth more than I'd ever owned. Right then, it just felt like the world getting smaller around me. When we crested the last rise, and I saw Laurel Gap for the first time, I understood why people laughed. The cabin sat crooked on its foundation, the roofline sagging in the middle, like a horse that had given up on standing straight. Shingles of 3 different colors clicked in the wind. Elias had patched it himself, clearly, using whatever he could find. The chimney leaned. One window shutter hung by a single hinge. Behind the cabin, a split-rail fence staggered inward like a line of drunks trying to hold each other up. And the pasture. I'd heard about it, of course. Everyone had made sure to describe it to me in detail at the reading of the will, but hearing about it and seeing it were different things. The field that should have been open grazing land was scarred with 6 sunken circles, each one roughly the width of a wagon wheel. The earth settled and patchy where it had been dug up and filled back in. It looked exactly like what people called it, a graveyard. Like someone had buried 6 bodies in the middle of an otherwise usable field and then tried to cover their work with sod. The smokehouse stood at the edge of the property, and this was the cruelest joke of all. It was new, freshly built, the pine board still pale, the roof straight, the door fitted properly on iron hinges. Elias had built a beautiful smokehouse, and then, according to everyone who knew him, he'd never hung a single ham inside it. He'd built it to satisfy the town's expectations, and then he'd spend his final summer burying meat in the ground instead. Holt helped me unload my 1 trunk and my carpet bag. He looked at the cabin, then at the pasture, then at me. "You got kin coming?" he asked. "No." He nodded slowly. "Well?" He climbed back onto the wagon. "Road'll be worse come winter." Then he was gone, and I was standing in the rain in front of a farm that had killed my husband and would probably kill me too. The cabin door stuck. I had to put my shoulder into it, and when it finally gave, the smell hit me first. Damp wool, cold ash, something sweet and rotting underneath, mouse droppings scattered across the floor. The stove had rusted around the edges. Elias's coat still hung on a peg behind the door, and I couldn't look at it, not yet. I found a candle stub and a box of matches. I found a sack of meal that had been gotten into by weevils. I found a cracked bowl, a rope bed with a straw mattress gone flat and musty, and a fireplace that refused to draw. Smoke poured back into the room the first time I tried to light it. I spent that first night coughing, huddled under Elias's coat because I couldn't bear to leave it hanging there like he might walk in and take it, and I thought, this is what I traded Mercy House for. This is my inheritance. I almost left the next morning. I want to be honest about that. I packed my carpet bag twice. The first time I unpacked it because I realized I had nowhere to go. The second time, I unpacked it because I got angry. Not at Elias, at myself, at the way my hands were shaking, at the fact that I was 17 years old and had been passed around like a piece of furniture nobody quite wanted. And now the one person who had seen something in me worth keeping was dead, and I was going to run away from his last gift because it was hard. I put the carpet bag down. I ate weevil-riddled meal boiled into paste, and I decided I would at least understand what he'd been doing before I gave up on it. The smokehouse door opened smoothly, better than the cabin door, better than anything else on this property. Inside, the air smelled like fresh-cut pine. Empty hooks hung from the rafters, waiting for hams that would never come. Clean shelves lined the walls. It was a perfect smokehouse, and it had never been used. I almost missed the loft. A narrow ladder led up to a platform under the peaked roof, and I climbed it only because I was looking for anything useful. Rope, maybe, or tools. What I found instead was a flower chest pushed against the back wall, and inside the flower chest, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them perfectly dry, were 7 leather-bound ledgers. I opened the first one, and my husband's handwriting looked up at me. Soil temperature, north fence line, 14 inches below surface, 42 degrees. Air temperature, 28 degrees. Difference, 14 degrees. The ground holds heat the air cannot keep. I sat down on the loft floor, my legs suddenly unwilling to hold me. The first ledger was filled with measurements, dates going back 14 years, soil temperatures at different depths, frost lines marked week by week through winters I'd been a child during, winters I'd spent in other people's houses earning my keep. Elias had been out here with a thermometer and a notebook, watching the ground, learning its secrets. The second ledger compared springhouse temperatures to root cellar temperatures to open-air storage. Detailed notes on food spoilage, when things rotted, how fast, under what conditions. Charts comparing salt concentrations to preservation length. One entry caught my eye. Packed pork, heavy salt, buried 4 feet, north-facing slope, recovered after 91 days. Condition, excellent, no spoilage. Conclusion, depth matters more than I thought. The third and fourth ledgers focused on barrels, types of wood, pitch sealing methods, failed experiments, one barrel that leaked, one that burst from pressure, one that let in groundwater and ruined everything inside, and successful experiments, the specific barrel construction that held, the sealing method that worked, the wood that lasted. The fifth ledger was maps, hand-drawn diagrams of this property showing each of the 6 pits he'd dug, drainage arrows, depth measurements, notes on what he'd buried where. Pit 1, northwest corner near the beach stump. Contents, 2 barrels, salted pork, approximately 200 pounds. Depth, 4 feet 6 inches. Cap, packed clay over oak board, sawed on top. And then I opened the 7th ledger. It was not measurements. It was not experiments. It was letters. Letters to me, dated over the year of our marriage. Letters he had never given me. And one final note, written in a shakier hand than the others, dated 3 days before he collapsed in the field. For Mara, if I do not come back from the field, I know you thought I was losing my mind this summer. I saw it in your face when I came in covered in mud from digging yet another pit instead of cutting hay like a sensible farmer. I couldn't explain it to you properly because I didn't have the words yet. But I have them now. What fire can reach, fire can take. What you trust to the earth remembers. I built that smokehouse because the town expected me to. But I've watched smokehouses burn. I've watched barns burn. I've watched men lose everything in a single night because they trusted walls and roofs to protect what mattered. The earth doesn't burn, Mara. What you put deep enough, the fire can never touch. You are the only person I've ever known who reads a field the way some folks read a book. You notice things, you remember things. If something happens to me, the ledgers are for you. Not because you're my wife. Because you're the only one who might understand. The pits are marked on the map in Ledger 5. The barrels are sealed and buried below frost line. roughly 600 pounds of salted beef and pork, enough to feed a family for a year if they're careful, enough to save a small settlement if something goes wrong. The town thinks I buried good food in dirt. They think I lost my mind. Let them think it. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. Trust the work. Trust the earth. Trust yourself. Your husband, Elias Boone Vale. I don't know how long I sat on that loft floor. The light changed around me. The rain stopped, started again, stopped. At some point I realized I was crying, but not from grief alone, from recognition, from the overwhelming understanding that someone had seen me clearly, had trusted me with something precious, and I had spent the last summer of his life doubting him. I had watched him come in covered in mud and thought he was going simple. I'd seen him buying extra salt and wondered if we could afford it. I'd heard the town laughing at Elias Vale's graveyard pasture and felt the shame of it, the embarrassment of being married to a man people called mad. And he had been building something for me the whole time. I thought about Mrs. Hargrove's voice at the reading, "The dead have found one final way to make sport of the living." I thought about the laughter. I thought about every person who had told me, in words or in silence, that I was inheriting a joke. They were wrong. They were all wrong, but I didn't know yet if I could prove it. The ledgers told me what was buried and where. They didn't tell me if the contents had survived 3 weeks underground while I sat in Mercy House being mocked. They didn't tell me if the barrels had held, if the seals had kept, if the meat inside was food or rot. The only way to know was to dig, and winter was coming. The next morning, I walked the pasture with ledger 5 open in my hands. The 6 sunken circles looked different now, not graves, but markers, storage points, hidden infrastructure that the whole town had mistaken for madness. I found the beech stump in the northwest corner, and I counted 16 steps north, then 32 west, just like the map said. The ground there was settled and patchy, covered with thin sod that had only had a few weeks to take root. I didn't have the tools to dig. Not yet. And I wasn't sure I had the strength, even if I found them. I was 17. I had lost weight I didn't have to lose during the week of his dying and the weeks that followed. And the thought of digging nearly 5 feet down through clay and rock made my arms ache just from imagining it. But I also didn't have a choice. The meal was almost gone. I had no money to buy more. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and I knew from Ledger 7 that Elias had been a laughingstock to most of them. I could walk to Hollow Creek and beg for work, but that would mean leaving the farm, and if I left now, I might never come back. I found a shovel in the cabin, rusted but usable. I found a pickaxe leaning against the smokehouse wall, and I found something else in the cabin that I hadn't noticed the first night. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin lined with field stone, containing 3 sealed crocks and 1 small barrel. The crocks held sauerkraut. The barrel held apples, small, wrinkled, but edible. Elias had left me enough to survive, barely, while I figured out the rest. I ate an apple standing in the root cellar, the first real food I'd had in days, and I cried again, because even in this small thing, he had thought of me. But the sauerkraut wouldn't last forever. The apples would rot by winter's end, and I still didn't know if the main store's the 600 pounds buried under the pasture were food or poison. The first weeks nearly killed me. I don't say that for dramatic effect. I mean it literally. I walked 9 miles to Hollow Creek to buy salt and lamp oil on credit because I couldn't afford to pay, and Silas Riddle, the storekeeper, looked me up and down and said, "You fixin' to eat dirt come March, girl? 'Cause that's what's in your pasture now." I told him it would be mine to chew. He laughed and gave me the credit anyway because even men who mock you will take your money eventually. I started rationing immediately, 1 meal a day, small. The sauerkraut stretched further than I expected. The apples I dried over the stove, sliced thin, laid out on the stones until they turned to leather. I foraged what I could find, black walnuts mostly, which take half an hour to crack and yield almost nothing. But almost nothing is better than actual nothing when you're that hungry. The first frost came in early October, and I spent a night convinced I would freeze to death because I couldn't get the chimney to draw properly. The smoke backed up until I was coughing so hard I thought I might pass out. I finally found the bird's nest blocking the flue at 3 in the morning, working by candlelight with my arm up the chimney until I was covered in soot and my eyes were streaming. That was the night I thought about going back. Really thought about it. I lay on the rope bed, wrapped in every piece of cloth I owned, and I let myself imagine walking down that mountain road, presenting myself at Mercy House, and asking Mrs. Hargrove to take me back in. I could feel how warm the dormitory would be. I could taste the breakfast porridge, even though I'd hated it when I lived there. I could hear Mrs. Hargrove's voice. I told you, Mara. The dead play cruel jokes on the living. I lay there for maybe an hour, running the calculation. Safety versus pride. Warmth versus ownership. Being fed versus being free. Then I got up and reread the note in Ledger 7. Trust the work. Trust the earth. Trust yourself. The next morning, I started digging. The first pit I opened wasn't one of the main storage sites. I was too scared for that. Instead, I found an entry in Ledger 3 about a test pit Elias had dug years earlier, shallow, experimental, on the north side of the property. According to his notes, it contained one small crock of salted pork, buried at 3 feet as a control test against the deeper pits. I dug for 2 days. The clay came up in heavy clods that stuck to the shovel. My shoulders burned after the first hour, and by the end of the first day, I could barely lift my arms. I had dug maybe 2 feet. I stood in that shallow hole at sunset, covered in red mud, and I thought, this is going to take forever. I'm going to starve before I reach anything. I ate a handful of dried apple and slept like the dead. The second day was worse. My muscles had stiffened overnight, and every motion sent pain shooting through my back and arms. But I kept digging. 2.5 feet, 3 feet, and then the shovel hit something that wasn't clay. I dropped to my knees and scraped the mud away with my hands. A crock lid emerged, a ceramic crock, sealed with wax around the rim, exactly as the ledger described. I worked it free of the earth, carried it into the cabin, and sat looking at it for maybe 10 minutes before I had the courage to open it. The wax seal cracked under my knife. The lid lifted, and inside was salt. And beneath the salt was meat. I pulled out one piece, rinsed it, boiled it twice to draw out the salt, and ate standing over the pot. It was dense. It was salty despite the boiling. It tasted like survival. I sat on the cabin floor and laughed. Then I cried. Then I laughed again. The test worked. The small crock, buried at 3 feet, had held for years, which meant the main barrels, buried deeper, sealed better, might hold too. But that was a small victory. One crock wouldn't get me through winter. The real test was still ahead of me. Opening one of the main pits, one of those 6 sunken circles in the pasture, and finding out if 600 pounds of buried meat was food or rot. I didn't have the strength to dig that deep alone. I knew it. The test pit had nearly broken me, and it was half the depth of the main storage. I would need help, or better tools, or more time than I had. What I got instead was Caleb Wren. He came up the road on a cold morning in late October, carrying a bundle of hoop iron over one shoulder and a Cooper's adze in his hand. He was 72 years old, white-bearded, walking with a limp that suggested old injury rather than age. I watched him from the cabin door, not sure whether to be afraid or hopeful. "You're the widow," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He looked at the pasture, at the 6 sunken circles, at the smokehouse standing empty and unused. "Your husband and I played checkers on Saturdays. He never could beat me, but he kept trying." He paused. "I built 2 of his first test barrels, the ones that leaked. The ledgers mention you." I didn't know what else to say. "You're the Cooper." He nodded. "I came to see if you dug them up yet." "1 test crock. It held." Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but close. "Show me." I showed him the crock, the meat inside, the wax seal I'd broken. He examined everything carefully, turning the crock in his hands, smelling the salt, pressing the meat with his thumb. "Elias wasn't burying food," he said finally. "He was burying tomorrow." I didn't understand what he meant at first, but over the next few weeks, as Caleb came back again and again to help me dig, to teach me how to reseal a barrel lid, to show me proper drainage swales so groundwater never sat above a buried cache. I started to understand. Elias hadn't been preparing for ordinary winter. He'd been preparing for disaster, for fire, for flood, for the kind of catastrophe that destroys everything above ground and leaves people standing in the ashes with nothing. He'd buried food the way squirrels bury nuts, the way root cellars preserve vegetables, the way the earth itself holds temperature steady while the air above it freezes and burns. And now I was going to find out if his theory worked at full scale. We opened the first main barrel in November. Caleb built a tripod from saplings to lift the weight, because a 100-pound barrel of salted meat is too heavy for a girl and an old man to haul by hand. We dug for 3 days, taking turns, going deeper than I'd ever dug before. 4 feet, 4.5, and then the shovel scraped wood. The barrel lid was swollen from moisture. For one terrible moment, I thought it had failed, that water had gotten in, that everything inside would be spoiled and reeking. Caleb heated his knife blade over a fire, worked it under the pitch seal, and pried. The lid lifted, and the smell that came up was salt and brine and cold, clean preservation. No rot, no spoilage. The meat beneath the salt layer was pale and firm, exactly like the test crock. But more of it, so much more, layer after layer of salted pork and beef, packed tight, sealed perfect, waiting. I knelt in the mud beside that open barrel, my hands raw and cracked, my whole body aching from 3 days of digging, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. Powerful. Not in the way of controlling others, but in the way of controlling my own survival. I had something the world couldn't take from me. I had food that couldn't burn, couldn't be stolen, couldn't rot in a collapsed smokehouse. I had tomorrow, buried deep enough that the fire could never reach. Caleb was watching me. He didn't say anything about the tears running down my face. He just stood there holding the barrel lid, waiting for me to finish feeling whatever I was feeling. "There are 5 more pits," he said finally. "Yes. We'd better check them before the ground freezes hard." We checked them. 2 more barrels were perfect. One had partial seepage in a corner, spoiling perhaps a quarter of the contents, but leaving the rest sound. One was a decoy. Elias had marked it as a test of pit construction, containing only drainage stones. And one had shifted during settling, cracking along the seal, and the meat inside had gone to black ruin. 5 barrels total, 4 usable. Roughly 480 pounds of preserved meat, plus the test crock. Enough to feed me for 2 years. Enough to feed a settlement if it came to that. Caleb taught me to reseal what we'd opened, using fresh pitch and careful technique. He taught me how to build new barrels from white oak staves, though I wouldn't have the materials to try until spring. He brought me scrap hoop iron from his shed, and a spare draw knife, and eventually a bundle of seasoned staves that Elias had ordered before he died. We didn't talk much while we worked. Caleb wasn't a man who filled silence with words. But he told me once, while we were warming our hands over a fire between digging shifts, about his son who died under a falling log, and his wife who died of pneumonia the same winter. He told me how he'd come close to walking into the woods and not coming back. He didn't say what stopped him. I didn't ask. By the time the first snow fell, I had enough buried food to survive. The sauerkraut and dried apples supplemented it. A rabbit I managed to snare supplemented it more. I was thinner than I'd ever been, my hands rough as bark, my wedding ring loose on my finger. But I was alive. And the town still thought I was sitting on a graveyard of spoiled meat. That was the end of the first year. I didn't know yet about the fire that was coming, the drought that would dry every well in the valley, the night the whole mountainside would glow orange while people ran screaming from their burning smokehouses. I didn't know yet that the same people who laughed at Elias Vale's graveyard pasture would come to me with their hats in their hands, begging for what I had buried. All I knew that first winter was this: my husband was right. The earth remembered what the fire could not touch. But the real test hadn't come yet, and when it came, it would change everything. Caleb came 3 or 4 times a week that first winter, weather permitting. He never stayed overnight. His own cabin was only 3 miles down the ridge, and he said he slept better in his own bed. But he stayed long enough each visit to teach me things I couldn't have learned from ledgers. He showed me how to read the grain in a stave, how to tell oak that would hold from oak that would split. He showed me how to work a draw knife without taking off my own fingers, pulling the blade toward my body at an angle that terrified me until it became natural. He taught me to pitch a seam in 3 passes, then 2, then 1, until the motion was as automatic as breathing. Your husband understood the science, Caleb told me once, while we were fitting hoops onto a practice barrel that would never hold anything but air. He understood temperature and salt and spoilage rates, but he couldn't build worth a damn. That's why he needed me for the barrels. He never told me that. He never told anyone much of anything. That was part of his trouble. Caleb set down his mallet and looked at me with something like apology in his eyes. I should have come up here more while he was alive, should have helped him explain what he was doing to folks who might have listened. But I thought he had time. We all think we have time. I didn't know how to respond to that. I just kept working on the hoop I was trying to fit, hammering it into place with more force than necessary. You've got his eyes, Caleb said. The way you look at things, like you're reading the page behind the page. My mother used to say that. I hadn't thought about it in years. She said I was always looking for the secret chapter. Caleb nodded. Elias was the same. He just didn't know how to tell people what he found when he got there. By January, I could build a barrel that would hold water. By February, I could build one that would hold pressure. The work settled into my body like a second skeleton. My shoulders thickened, my hands calloused into rough pads. My grip strengthened until I could feel the difference between tight enough and too tight without measuring. I stopped feeling like a girl playing at being a farmer. I started feeling like whatever came after that. But Caleb's cough was getting worse. He'd had it since I met him, a dry, rattling thing that came up from deep in his chest. In October, it was occasional. By December, it came every hour. By February, he had to stop work sometimes and bend over with his hands on his knees, waiting for it to pass. It's nothing, he said when I asked. It doesn't sound like nothing. I've had this cough for 15 years. If it was going to kill me, it would have done it already. I didn't believe him, but I didn't push. There was too much work to do. Spring came late that year, and cold. The ground stayed frozen until April, and even then the thaw was hesitant, like the earth wasn't sure winter was really over. I used the time to repair the cabin roof, patching the leaks with pine tar and salvaged shingles. I rebuilt the fence along the south pasture, using posts Caleb helped me split and set. I dug drainage trenches above the pit sites, following Elias's notes on water flow, making sure groundwater would never pool above the buried barrels. And I started thinking about expansion. The system worked. I knew that now. 480 pounds of meat had survived underground while every smokehouse in the county stood vulnerable to flame, to rot, to whatever else the world decided to throw at wooden walls. But 480 pounds was what Elias had buried before he died. If I wanted to prove this was a real method, not just one man's eccentric preparation, but something other people could use, I needed to do it myself. Butcher my own hogs, pack my own barrels, bury my own stores. The problem was livestock. I had no hogs, no cattle, nothing worth butchering, and I had almost no money. The credit I'd taken from Silas Riddle had carried me through winter, but I'd have to pay it back somehow before he'd extend more. I started trading in June. Small amounts at first, a 10-pound piece of the recovered pork, wrapped in cloth, carried 9 miles to Hollow Creek on foot. The first person I approached was Widow Peel, who ran a boarding house and always needed meat for her table. She looked at the piece I offered, sniffed it, pressed it with her thumb. "Where'd you get this?" "My husband's stores. The ones he buried in the ground." She said it flat, like she was testing whether I'd flinch. "Yes. Folks say that meat's gone bad, buried in dirt like that. Folks say a lot of things. This piece is sound. Boil it twice to draw the salt, and it'll taste better than half the ham in this county." She bought it for lamp oil and a length of cotton cloth. Word got around. By August, I had traded enough to buy a young sow and a shoat from a farmer 2 hollows over. By October, I had slaughtered the shoat, packed the meat in one of the new barrels I'd built with Caleb's help, and buried it in a fresh pit Caleb and I had dug together. 3 feet 6 inches deep, shallower than Elias's main pits, but deep enough to test the method with my own hands. The first season of expansion. But not everyone was pleased to see me succeeding. Jasper Ketch showed up at my fence line in late October, 3 days after I'd finished filling the new pit. He was a big man, heavy through the shoulders, the kind of farmer who measured his worth in acres and head of cattle. He owned the land to the south of Laurel Gap, good bottomland, easier to work than my stony ridge. He'd made it clear through various intermediaries that he expected me to fail and that he was prepared to buy the property cheap when I did. "Widow Vale," he said, not bothering to dismount from his horse. "Here you're still playing in the dirt." "I'm preserving meat, Mr. Ketch, same as anyone with a smokehouse." "Not the same at all." He leaned forward in his saddle, and I could smell tobacco and something sour on his breath. "Smokehouses are how civilized people store food. What you're doing is something else, something unnatural." "Unnatural how?" "Burying things is for the dead, not for food, not for anything decent people want to put in their mouths." He looked at the pasture, at the fresh-turned earth of the new pit. "Your husband was touched in the head. Whole county knew it. And now you're carrying on his foolishness like it means something." "My husband understood something most people don't." I kept my voice level, but I could feel my hands wanting to shake. The earth holds temperature. It doesn't burn. It doesn't collapse in a storm. What you put deep enough, the fire can never touch. "Pretty words for a girl playing in mud." Jasper spat into the grass. "I'll give you $40 for this place, right now. Walk away with cash in your hand, find yourself a position in town, and stop embarrassing yourself." "No." "50 then. That's more than this rock pile is worth, and we both know it." "The answer is still no." He stared at me for a long moment. "Widows don't keep mountain farms, Mrs. Vale. They lose them. One bad winter, one sickness, one thing going wrong that you can't fix alone." He gathered his reins. "I'll be here when that happens, and the price will be lower." I watched him ride away. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from anger. I had $40 offered in my pocket, and I'd turned it down because a dead man's journals told me the ground held secrets worth more than cash. I hoped I wasn't wrong. The winter of 1900 was easier than the first. I knew what I was doing. The cabin stayed warm, the chimney drew properly, the drainage trenches kept the pit sites dry. Caleb came less often, the walk was harder for him now, and his cough had settled into something constant, a background rattle that never quite stopped. But he came when he could, and we worked when he was able. By spring of 1901, I had 3 new barrels buried. The test pit from October had held perfectly. The shoat meat came up sound and savory, better even than Elias's original stores because I'd adjusted the salt ratio based on his notes. I opened it in front of Caleb, and he tasted a sliver right there at the pit edge, chewing slowly, nodding. "You've got it," he said. "The method works in your hands, same as it did in his." "It's his method. I just followed the instructions." "No." Caleb shook his head. "Instructions only get you so far. The rest is understanding, and that you can't teach. Either you have it, or you don't." He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his face before. Pride, maybe. Or relief. "Elias chose right when he chose you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, but I felt it settle into me like a weight I was finally strong enough to carry. That summer, Dr. Nettie Pembroke came to visit. She was the county physician's daughter, trained in medicine herself at a time when most people thought women shouldn't touch science. She'd heard stories about the buried meat, some calling it witchcraft, some calling it madness, some saying the widow Vale was poisoning people with rotten pork. She came to see for herself. I showed her the pits. I showed her the ledgers. I explained the salt ratios, the temperature differentials, the drainage systems, the pitch-sealed barrels. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she examined a piece of the stored meat with the same careful attention she might have given a patient. "This isn't witchcraft," she said finally. "This is method. The salt inhibits bacterial growth. The stable underground temperature slows decomposition. The sealed barrels prevent contamination." She looked at me with something approaching amazement. "Why did nobody listen to your husband?" Because he buried food in the ground instead of hanging it in a building. Because that's not how things are done. How things are done. She said it like a curse. Half of what I learned in medical school was unlearning how things are done. She handed the meat back to me. I'd like to write about this, for a county circular, maybe a farm paper, with your permission and your husband's name credited as originator. I said yes. It was the first time anyone official had taken the work seriously. But the real test was still coming, and I didn't know it yet. The autumn of 1901 was dry. Not desperately dry, not yet, but dry enough that people noticed. The wells held, but lower than usual. The creeks ran thin. Farmers talked about it at Riddle's store, comparing notes on rainfall, predicting that winter would bring snow enough to fill the aquifers back up. Winter came, but the snow didn't. December was cold and clear. January was colder and clearer. The ground froze hard, but no snow fell to insulate it. The wells kept dropping. And then, on a night in late January, when the wind came howling down from the ridge like something alive and angry, a lantern fell in a shed at the edge of Hollow Creek. I smelled the smoke before I saw the light. I was in my cabin mending a shirt by lamplight when the first whiff came through the crack under the door. Wood smoke, but wrong somehow. Too sharp. Too much of it. Mixed with something acrid that caught in my throat. I went to the window and looked down the valley, and the whole lower slope was glowing orange. Fire. Not a controlled burn, not a cooking fire that got away. A wildfire spreading through winter-dry brush and dead leaves, and the wooden structures of a settlement that had never imagined fire in January. The wind was pushing it uphill, jumping from roof to roof, from haystack to haystack, from smokehouse to smokehouse. I could hear shouting, even from this distance, voices carrying up the mountain, screaming names, screaming for water, screaming for help that wasn't coming fast enough. I stood at my window and watched Hollow Creek burn. The fire took the Riddle family's smokehouse first, then the Petersons' barn with 3 months of hay inside, then the widow Peel's henhouse and the shed where she kept her meal stores. The flames moved faster than anyone could fight them, driven by wind that wouldn't quit, feeding on wood that had spent months getting dry enough to light with a spark. By dawn, the lower valley looked like the aftermath of a war, black timbers standing where buildings had been, stone chimneys with nothing around them, and everywhere the smell of char and ash and something worse, the smell of good food turned to carbon, of stored provisions becoming smoke. 7 families lost their winter stores that night, smokehouses full of ham gone, barns full of meal and hay gone, root cellars with wooden doors that caught fire and burned down into the earth, destroying what was meant to be safe below. Some people got out with the clothes on their backs and nothing else. Some people got out carrying children who were crying for breakfast that didn't exist anymore. And up on my ridge, in my pasture full of sunken circles, 600 pounds of salted meat sat untouched beneath frozen clay. The fire never reached Laurel Gap. The wind shifted around 3 a.m, pushing the flames sideways instead of up, and by dawn the fire had burned itself out against the rocky slopes where nothing would catch. My cabin stood, my smokehouse stood, and under my pasture, sealed in pitch and oak and buried below the depth that fire could reach, Elias Vale's provisions waited. I didn't go down to the valley that first day. I watched from the ridge and I tried to understand what I was seeing. All those smokehouses I'd envied, solid wooden buildings where sensible people kept their food, reduced to ash and ember. All those cellars with wooden hatches, burned through from above. All those families who had laughed at Elias Vale's graveyard pasture, now standing in the snow with nothing. The second day, I loaded a pack frame with tools and walked down. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Entire homesteads gutted, children with soot on their faces and hollow eyes, women trying to cook meals from scorched corn scraped out of ruined bins, men standing in the wreckage of their barns, not speaking, not moving, just staring at what had been their provision for winter. Ruth Riddle found me first. She was Silas's daughter-in-law, a woman who had once laughed at me in the general store when someone made a joke about buried meat. Now she came toward me carrying her youngest boy on her hip, and her eyes had the desperate look of someone who had tried everything else. "Mrs. Vale," she said, and then she stopped, like she couldn't figure out how to ask what she needed to ask. "Come up to my place tomorrow morning," I told her. "Bring something to carry food in." She blinked. "You'd share with us?" After what folks said? "I'd share with anyone who's hungry. That's the whole point." Ruth came the next morning. She brought 2 empty sacks and her boy. I took her to the first pit, where Caleb and I had already dug down and opened a barrel. The smell of clean brine rose up into the freezing air. "That's the buried meat," Ruth said. Her voice was strange. It kept. Through the fire and everything. It kept. My husband said the earth remembers what the fire can't reach. I cut a 5-pound piece from the open barrel, wrapped it in cloth, and handed it to her. "Boil it twice to draw the salt. Save the broth." She took it like she was accepting a holy relic. "I'll pay you back. When things settle, when we rebuild." "You don't have to pay me back. Just come again, if you need more." She left with tears in her eyes. The next day, she came back with her neighbor. The day after that, 6 families came. By the end of the week, there was a line of people at my cabin every morning carrying buckets and sacks and baskets, waiting for their share of what I'd pulled from the ground. I gave without keeping count at first. Then I realized I had to keep count, or I'd run out before spring. So I started a ledger, names, dates, amounts, 5-pound shares for families, smaller amounts for widows living alone, larger amounts for households that had taken in neighbors who'd lost everything. The barrels went faster than I'd expected. I opened the second, then the third, then the fourth. 480 pounds of meat divided by 7 families with children, plus widows, plus the elderly, plus everyone else who came. Caleb helped when he could. His cough was constant now, and some days he couldn't make the walk at all. But on the days he came, he helped me dig, helped me measure, helped me keep the distribution fair. "They don't deserve this," he said once, watching the line of people waiting outside my fence. Half of them laughed at Elias to his face. Maybe not. I wrapped another piece and handed it to the next family in line. But the meat doesn't know that, and neither does hunger. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're a better person than I am." "No, I'm just a person who knows what it feels like to be hungry, and I won't make anyone else feel that way if I can help it." The hardest moment came in the second week. Jasper Ketch showed up at my fence line. Not on horseback this time, walking, hat in hand, looking at the ground instead of at me. His barns had burned. His smokehouse had burned. His stored provisions, the ones he'd been so proud of keeping in proper civilized buildings, were ash and char. "Mrs. Vale," he said. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. I waited. I was wondering. He stopped, started again. "If you had any to spare..." He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't bring himself to ask for food from the woman he'd called unnatural, from the dirt he'd said decent people shouldn't eat from. I made him wait a long moment, not because I wanted him to suffer, though part of me did, I won't lie about that, but because I wanted him to understand what he was asking for. He was asking to eat from Elias Vale's graveyard pasture. He was asking to benefit from the method he'd called madness. Then I cut a piece from the opened barrel, wrapped it in cloth, and handed it over the fence. "Boil it twice," I said. "Save the broth." He took it. His hands were shaking. "Your husband," he started, "was right." "Yes." He looked at the wrapped meat in his hands like he didn't know what to do with it. "He was right, and I was wrong. I'll say that to anyone who asks. You don't have to say anything. Just remember it." He left without another word, but I saw his shoulders shaking as he walked away, and I knew it wasn't from the cold. By March, the worst was over. The fire-damaged families had found ways to rebuild, to share space with relatives, to scrabble together enough food from what remained and what I'd given. Spring would bring gardens and fresh-killed game and the possibility of normal again. But things had changed. When people looked at Laurel Gap now, they didn't see Elias Vale's graveyard pasture. They saw the farm that had fed them when everything else burned. They saw the method that worked when smokehouses failed. Dr. Pembroke came up from Hollow Creek with a notepad and a box of writing supplies. She spent 3 days documenting everything: the pit construction, the barrel sealing, the salt ratios, the drainage systems. She asked questions I couldn't always answer, and when I couldn't, I showed her the ledgers and let Elias answer instead. "I want to write this up properly," she said. "For the county agricultural agent, maybe for a paper in Knoxville. People should know this method exists." "Make sure you credit him," I said. "Elias Boone Vale. He figured it out. I just followed instructions." "You did more than that." She looked at me with something like respect. "You proved it worked. You fed a settlement from a pasture everyone said was worthless. That's not following instructions. That's making them real." A week after Dr. Pembroke left, I had another visitor, one I hadn't expected. Mrs. Prudence Hargrove came up the mountain road in a hired wagon, her steel gray bun somewhat looser than I remembered, her posture less rigid. She looked older than 2 years should have made her. She looked like someone who had been carrying a weight she couldn't put down. I watched her climb down from the wagon and approach my fence. I didn't move to meet her. I didn't move at all. "Mrs. Vale," she said, and then, after a pause, "Mara." "Mrs. Hargrove." She stood there for a moment, her hands folded in front of her, looking at the cabin, the smokehouse, the pasture with its sunken circles. "I heard what you did during the fire, feeding people." "Yes." "I came to say—" She stopped, started again. "I came because there's something you should know, something I should have told you a long time ago." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small bundle of papers, tied with a ribbon that had faded from red to pink. She held it out to me. "Your husband wrote to me. Twice. The first time was before he married you. He asked me to make sure you were treated well at Mercy House. He said you had a mind like a scientific instrument, and it shouldn't be wasted on laundry." Her voice cracked. "I burned that letter. I thought it was inappropriate. A man asking about a girl's education." I took the bundle from her hands. My fingers weren't steady. The second letter came after his death. He'd sent it while he was still alive, but the mail took time. He asked me to tell you about the ledgers in the smokehouse. He said if anything happened to him, you should know where to find his work because you were. She stopped. Because you were the only person who might understand. "You never told me." "No, I never told you." She looked at the ground. "I thought it was kinder to let you go to this place without any more of his madness in your head. I thought you'd see it for what it was and come back to Mercy House within a month." "And if I had come back?" "I would have placed you in a domestic position, some household in Elizabethton. You would have spent your life cooking and cleaning and never knowing what your husband left for you." I stood there holding the faded bundle, feeling something rise in my chest that might have been rage or might have been grief or might have been both at once. "I was wrong about him," Mrs. Hargrove said. "And I was worse wrong about you. I called it foolishness because I didn't want to believe that a girl I had underestimated, that I'd kept small and quiet and manageable, could be chosen wisely by someone who saw what I refused to see." She reached into her coat again and pulled out a single piece of paper, creased and worn. "This fell behind the letter desk. I found it last month when we were cleaning. It's from him. Your name is on it." I took the paper, unfolded it, and there, in Elias's handwriting, was a single line. For Mara, who reads the page behind the page. I closed my eyes. The wind blew across the pasture, carrying the smell of thawing earth and possibility. "I forgive you," I said finally. Not because forgetting is easy, but because Elias trusted the earth to keep what mattered, and I want to be as wise as he was. Mrs. Hargrove nodded once. She didn't wipe her eyes, but I could see they were wet. "The county paper is writing about what you did," she said. "About the fire and the buried stores. They asked me for a comment, and I told them the truth, that your husband was a man of science and you are his proper heir." She got back in the wagon and rode away. I never saw her again, but I kept that piece of paper in Ledger 7 next to Elias's final note for the rest of my life. Caleb died in April of 1903. I found him in his chair on his own porch, a bowl of soup still warm on the table beside him, his hands folded in his lap like he'd just sat down to rest for a moment. The cough had finally stopped. I buried him on the knoll behind his cabin, where he could see the valley he'd lived in for 73 years. I planted 2 laurel shrubs and 1 apple whip on his grave, because he'd always said laurel was the prettiest thing on the mountain, and apples were the most useful. He left me his cooper's tools, his shed full of seasoned white oak staves, and a note giving me permission to use his name when I sold barrels. "Tell them old Caleb Wren built the first ones," the note said. "They might buy more if they think it's haunted. I still miss him. Some people you only get for a little while, and the having and the losing both change you into someone you wouldn't have become otherwise." I married 3 years later. His name was Jonah Pembroke, Nettie's widowed cousin, a blacksmith from the next county over, a man who listened more than he talked and never once tried to make me smaller than I was. We had 3 children, and I will not bore you with their stories because this story is not about them. What I will tell you is this: the method spread. Dr. Pembroke's circular reached 2 counties, then 3. Then a farm paper in Knoxville published a longer article, with diagrams drawn from Elias's ledgers and my own additions. People came to visit: farmers, agricultural agents, a professor from a university who wanted to study the temperature differentials underground. Some of them were respectful, some of them were condescending. All of them left knowing more than they'd arrived with. I built 7 more pits over the years. I taught 14 people to build their own. I wrote letters to farm wives in 3 states, explaining salt ratios and barrel construction and drainage principles. The unused smokehouse stood until 1926, when Jonah finally tore it down for lumber. It had never held a single ham. My hands got old. They stopped looking like a young woman's hands and started looking like roots, like the things that hold trees to the earth when the wind tries to tear them away. But they never forgot the work. They knew a barrel stave the way a pianist knows a keyboard. They could judge pitch thickness by touch alone. Jonah died in 1941, quiet in his sleep, and I buried him next to the first pit Elias ever dug. By then, the pasture didn't look like a graveyard anymore. It looked like what it was: a system, a method, an answer to a question the town hadn't known how to ask. I died on a Tuesday morning in late April, 1947. They found me kneeling near the first pit marker, a trowel in one hand, and fresh-turned soil on my skirt. My youngest daughter said I looked like I'd just bent down to check on something and meant to get back up in a minute. Maybe I did. Maybe there was one more measurement to take, one more note to add to the ledgers, one more adjustment to make before the work was really done. But the work was done. Or rather, the work goes on, carried forward by people who learned what Elias taught me, what the earth remembered when everything else burned. His line is carved now on a stone marker at the entrance to Laurel Gap, next to the historical plaque the county put up in 1938. What fire can reach, fire can take. What you trust to the earth remembers. The same words a dying man wrote to a girl everyone had given up on. The same words that lit up something in me when I read them by lantern light in an empty smokehouse. The same words that turned a graveyard pasture into a salvation. They laughed at us, you know. Both of us. Elias for his digging, me for my inheritance, both of us for believing that something buried could be worth more than something standing tall in the daylight. And now people come from other states to see the pits. They take photographs. They copy the diagrams. They go home and dig their own holes in the ground, and they find out what we found out. That the surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land. That what matters most is often buried. That the things people mock you for might be the very things that save you. So let me ask you something. What have you buried because someone told you it was foolish? What work have you abandoned because the people around you couldn't see what you were building? What inheritance are you sitting on right now? A skill you've neglected, a dream you've set aside, a strange idea that keeps coming back no matter how many times you push it away, that you've convinced yourself is worthless. Because I'll tell you what I learned on that mountain. The thing everyone laughs at is often the thing that works when nothing else does. The person who sees what nobody else sees isn't crazy. They're just early. And the conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. I was 17. I had nobody. I had $1.17 and a farm everyone called a joke, and I turned it into something that fed a valley when the fire came. You don't need permission. You don't need approval. You don't need the people who laughed at you to apologize before you start digging. You just need to trust the work. Trust the earth. Trust yourself. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own buried provisions, your own graveyard pasture, your own sealed ledgers waiting to be opened, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary lives out of the nothing they were given. Because I'm telling you, your pasture is not a joke. It's a beginning. Start digging.